Trevor Stevenson, and welcome to Your Story Will Be Different. This is a narrative play podcast where I tell you the story that was born from a playthrough of a solo tabletop role-playing game. For this session, we're playing Kthonic Descent by Justin Shu, in which you are a hero, or a villain, who descends into darkness, and it could be a dungeon, an ancient ruin, or any other type of descent for your character to go into, as an opportunity for both building the character and some world building. With that said, let's dive right in. The island of Stillbreak was a jagged shard on the edge of the world. Its dense forests were surrounded by craggy cliffs, and much of it was obscured by an unrelenting mist. Cutting through the veil, Isjenn guided his longboat toward the island's rocky shore. He clutched the bounty notice from the Jarl in his hands. He had heard tell of the islands from the denizens he met in taverns halfway gone from the mead. They often spoke of the balance of peril and spoils to be found in Stillbreak. His broad frame and thick, weathered-hardened skin had withstood countless perils, but the quiet beyond the waves unsettled him. Flatshade was one of the first colonies established on Stillbreak, but it had gone silent. No messengers, no trade, no signs of life. The journey to Stillbreak had been eerily uneventful. The usual perils of the sea he had come to expect and steeled himself for had avoided him as though the island commanded a wide berth. Squalls, hostile sea creatures, and unpredictable currents all heeded the island's demands. He immediately noticed, as his longboat scraped against the pebbled shore, that the air felt heavy. Mist curled along the treetops, and the only sound was the distant, hollow echo of waves breaking against distant cliffs. Flatshade had meant to be a welcome beacon of civilization on this frontier. The founders of this colony saw it as a place where settlers had supposedly carved out a new life in defiance of the nature of the island. Yet as Isjenn scanned the shoreline, there were no signs of human life to greet him. No fishing nets hung from poles, no smoke rising from hearth fires. The structures he eventually glimpsed further inland stood in eerie disrepair. Roofs sagged, walls leaned precariously, and doors swung open as if inviting him to step into abandonment and ruin. The forest encroached on the village as though nature itself sought to reclaim it. Vines snaked over walls and roofs. Flowers bloomed where cobblestone should have been. He'd seen abandoned settlements before, but this whole thing felt wrong. He made his way toward the largest structure at the center of the community, which he assumed had once been the longhouse. The wooden doors hung crookedly on its hinges, creaking softly as he pushed it aside. Inside, benches, tables, and long-forgotten tools of governance were covered in dust. A map was pinned to one wall, but it had faded beyond recognition, and its edges had curled and been eaten away by time. Isjenn crouched by the remnants of a fire pit at the center of the room. Cold ashes greeted his fingers. No warmth, no sign of recent use. Whoever had been here was long gone. But why? Disease? Conflict? His mind was in full sprint when he heard the first sign of anything other than himself. A distant splash echoed from the direction of the shore. Isjenn rose, muscles tensing as he instinctively gripped his hammer. He exited the building swiftly and scanned the fog-laden path he had walked earlier. For a moment, there was nothing but stillness and the sound of his breathing. Then another splash, closer this time. He descended the slope toward the rocky beach, boots crunching on the gravel. The mist thickened even more as he approached the shoreline, and he could barely see past the hammer he held in front of him. He nearly reached the water's edge when a deep, guttural growl resonated from the waves. The island had finally welcomed him, and it did so with teeth. A water troll erupted from the surf, dragging him into the icy depths with its sinewy strength and snapping jaws. Its massive, clawed hands gripped his torso with crushing strength as it thrashed violently, attempting to pull him further under. Salt water stung his eyes and burned up his nose as he struggled to breathe. The creature's bulbous eyes shimmered in the murk as it lunged again, teeth gnashing inches from his face. Isjenn managed to deflect the crushing embrace, wielding his hammer with practiced fury as the cold sapped his strength. He twisted his body, driving his knee into the creature's midsection, loosening its grip just enough to swing his weapon. The hammer struck true, cracking against the troll's skull with a resonant thud. It roared in pain under the waves, releasing him briefly, but cut his leg with a claw in the process. The beast wasn't finished. It surged forward through the cloud of blood in the water and snapped its jaws once more. Isjenn's instincts kicked in as he grabbed a jagged rock from the seafloor and rammed it into the creature's gills. With a final pained thrash, the troll retreated into the depths, with its own blood clouding the water in its wake. Gasping for air, Isjenn dragged himself onto the shore. He collapsed onto the damp sand for a moment, catching his breath. The chill of the encounter lingered in his bones, but he couldn't afford to rest for long. He scanned the tree line. Was this creature responsible for the colony's disappearance? Possibly, but the whole community? This might be enough for the Jarl back home, but he needed definitive proof. A breeze pushed the fog and it receded slightly. As he stood and wiped the salt water from his face, he could see deeper into the forest now. Twisted trees formed natural archways and an actual path to follow. Isjenn adjusted his gear, bandaged his leg, and began his journey inland. The trees whispered around him. This was no ordinary wilderness. The island was watching him. Stillbreak's landscape grew stranger as Isjenn ventured further from the shoreline. The trees seemed to lean toward him as he passed, and their branches formed grotesque silhouettes in the fading light. The ground beneath his boots shifted subtly, and he noticed patterns in the soil, spiraling concentric circles that appeared unnaturally deliberate. He took note of the strange flora lining the forest path. Large, spiral-shaped flowers pulsed faintly, and their petals opened and closed in rhythmic cycles. A deep hum, almost imperceptible at first, resonated through the air. Isjenn paused, crouching to observe one of the flowers more closely. As he did, he realized that small bioluminescent insects flitted in and out of the blooms. His grip on his hammer tightened as he continued through the dense foliage. Time seemed to stretch, the shifting light making it difficult to gauge the passage of hours. Eventually, the path opened into a clearing, and in its center stood a large stone obelisk. It was partly overgrown with moss and vines, but worn, ancient symbols covered its surface. Isjenn approached cautiously and absentmindedly traced the strange markings with his fingers. The wind picked up suddenly, carrying with it a faint whisper that seemed to echo through the clearing. He froze and scanned his surroundings but saw no movement. The whisper faded as quickly as it had come. He now understood. Whatever happened to the settlers of Flatshade, it had left a mark on the land itself. Or perhaps it was the land that had reacted to them. Days of walking through the path in the middle of the island passed. Isjenn's trek led him to a discovery that stole his breath. Deep within the center of the island, beneath a series of beautifully carved, interconnected caves, lay a vast, underground metropolis. His torchlight danced around towering stone spires and bridges suspended over chasms of glowing crystalline formations. The architecture was awe-inspiring, but equally unnerving. For all the grandeur, engineering, and artistry, the decay of it all spoke of a civilization that had been lost to time. He walked across one of the stone bridges, noting the craftsmanship beneath his feet. It still felt smooth and polished despite the centuries that must have passed. Ornate carvings adorned the railings, and they depicted scenes of both prosperity and catastrophe. One section showed figures harnessing steam of molten rocks. Their hands were raised in triumph. Another depicted what looked like a great calamity, buildings crumbling and shadowy forms rising from the depths. This was very much unlike the homeland of Isjenn. Isjenn's people built for function and survival. Their villages were fortresses against the elements, and their homes were sturdy but plain. Every structure had purpose, just as every tool was honed for necessity. Yet here, beauty and ambition had shaped this world. The civilization must have sought to conquer nature not through defiance, but through mastery of the Earth's very core. He marveled at a massive central tower that stretched into the cavern's ceiling. Steam vents lined its base, hissing softly like the breath of a slumbering giant. The air grew warmer as he approached, and the scent of sulfur mingled with something metallic. He wondered what drove the people of this place to live so deep beneath the surface. Was it weather, power, fear, or something else? As he wandered further, Isjenn noticed remnants of life. There were tools abandoned mid-use. There were tables set for meals that had never been eaten. But there were no bodies, no skeletons. He imagined the colonists of Flatshade stumbling upon this place, their awe perhaps mirroring his own he was experiencing. He paused near a large mosaic embedded in the floor. It depicted a massive figure with many arms, its face obscured by a swirling halo of fire. Surrounding it were smaller figures in various states of reverence and terror. The artistry was unquestionably exquisite, but the depiction made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Stone scraped against stone and broke the silence. Isjenn's hammer was in his hand in an instant. He scanned the shadows, muscles tensed. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, from a distant corridor, he heard it again. This time, followed by a faint whisper. The corridor in question led Isjenn deeper into the cavernous metropolis, the warmth of the geothermal currents rising around him. It wasn't much longer before he noticed the faint flicker of movement in the shadows. His pace slowed, muscles coiled, senses heightened. Out of the darkness, a figure stumbled toward him, ragged and wild-eyed.
Stop!
The man gasped, collapsing to his knees. Isjenn lowered his hammer slightly and stepped forward. The man's appearance was pitiful. His skin was pale, almost pure white, and his hair hung in tangled clumps. He mumbled incoherently and gestured wildly.
They watch from the corners. The walls bit square. But don't look too long. It's awake now. It's always awake.
The man clutched his head.
They thought they could. But the fire.
His eyes darted towards Isjenn, wide and frantic.
You shouldn't be here. None of us should be here.
Calm yourself. Isjenn crouched beside him. Who are you? What happened to the settlers? The man shuddered violently.
Flatshade? No, not Flatshade. It's the place between the place. The ones who dig.
A haunted look flashed across his face.
The ones who sing beneath the rock. They're still there. They never left.
Isjenn's brow furrowed. The man's words were like fragments of a nightmare, yet there was a disturbing coherence beneath the madness.
What do you mean? Who's still here?
The man began rocking backwards and forwards.
Down, down, down past the steam, past the dark. They're waiting. It'll call to you. It always does. You'll see. You'll see.
Before Isjenn could press further, the man screamed suddenly, scrambling to his feet.
Don't go deeper. You'll never come back. You'll be like the rest.
He bolted into the shadows, his ragged footsteps echoing away. For a long moment, Isjenn stood in silence. This island, and whatever lay beneath it, was more than he had anticipated. He took a steady breath and resumed his path forward. The corridor widened, revealing a vast antechamber where torchlight barely reached the distant walls. In the center lay a man clad in armor that shimmered like the surface of molten metal hardened into form. He clutched a massive sword whose blade was chipped and stained. He lay slumped against a crumbling pillar. Isjenn approached cautiously, but the man's eyes opened as he stirred. His breath was ragged, each exhalation accompanied by a wet, rattling sound. His eyes opened slowly. They were clouded, but still burning with intensity.
You.
His voice was barely audible.
Are you another vision? Or real?
I'm real. What happened here? The warrior coughed violently, and blood stained his lips.
You're too late. Too late to stop it. But you can. You can stop the next.
His hands trembled as he gestured toward the corridor behind him.
The creature took them all. It seeks the heart. The source.
The source? The warrior's gaze sharpened for a moment.
Power. Life. This place's soul. If it reaches the core, everything will fall.
His head slumped forward as his strength finally waned.
Don't let it.
Isjenn knelt beside him, but the warrior's breathing slowed and finally ceased. He murmured a silent prayer before returning his grip to his hammer. The path ahead stretched into darkness, but he could no longer turn back. Time in the depths beneath Stillbreak became unbound, an endless loop of silence, echoes, and unseen eyes. Isjenn could no longer tell how many hours or days had passed since he had encountered the fallen armored warrior. The air grew dense from heat from unseen geothermal vents. He continued to press forward and found a tunnel that narrowed uncomfortably. Ahead, the walls glistened with moisture, but there was also a faint, undulating movement, as though the rock itself breathed. He slowed his steps, and it was then that he heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible squelching. The torch in his hand cast long, flickering shadows on the uneven walls. He saw them then. They clung to the ceiling in writhing clusters, leeches, grotesquely large, and their bodies glistened like polished ebony. Their circular maws pulsated as they sensed his presence. One detached from above and with a wet thud landed on his back. He swung his body weight to the side and felt the leech's slick body graze off of his armor. With a grunt, he brought down the hammer hard, crushing the creature under its weight. a foul-smelling ichor splattered across the stone floor. More leeches above began to stir. They dropped from the ceiling one by one. Their movements were unsettlingly coordinated. Isjenn realized he was being surrounded. He took a step back. His boots slipped slightly on the ichor-coated floor. The air grew filled with a nauseating stench of decay and damp rot.
"No escape here if I'm trapped,"
he muttered, forcing himself to breathe through his mouth as he scanned the room. His eyes caught a faint glimmer in the distance, where the tunnel widened into another chamber. He sprinted, hammer in hand. The leeches lunged after him, their bodies slithering with unnatural speed. One leapt from the shadows, landing on his leg. Isjenn staggered, but kept his footing. He reached over to his leg, gripping the creature's slimy body, and tore it off with a growl. He hurled it into the darkness and limped forward. The tunnel suddenly opened into a cavern, and Isjenn's boots skidded to a halt as he nearly stumbled into a chasm. Across the gap, a network of bridges and platforms rose like skeletal remains. They were remnants of the forgotten civilization's mining operations. Steam continued to hiss from vents along the wall, and the heat seared against his skin even from this distance. The leeches hesitated at the tunnel's edge, as if unwilling to cross into this part of the underground world. Isjenn took a deep breath. Whatever had driven the creatures back didn't necessarily mean safety awaited him here. But it was the only path forward. As he crossed the first bridge, he had a memory surface, a flash of his childhood. He and the other village children had once dared each other to explore a series of caves near their settlement. It had been a dangerous game, tempting fate with unpredictable shifts of earth and hidden pitfalls. Isjenn had been among the boldest, leading the others deeper than ever before. He remembered the thrill of those reckless moments, the exhilaration of defying the unknown. But that day had ended in tragedy. One of the boys, younger and slower, had slipped into a crevasse. They had tried to save him, but by the time help arrived, it was too late. The elders had scolded him at the time, but Isjenn carried the weight of that guilt for years. "Curiosity is a blade," his uncle had said afterwards, and the words etched into Isjenn's memory. "Sharp and unforgiving if you wield it carelessly." Now, as he ventured further into this ancient labyrinth, those words echoed in his mind. The cavern opened into a vast hall filled with pools of still, luminous water. Stone platforms surrounded the pools, and along their edge lay tools and nets. The fishing implements were crafted with a mix of practicality and artistry. The colonists had clearly discovered this place and had used it for sustenance. The bioluminescent fish beneath the surface glided in measuring patterns, their scales reflecting in an unnatural blue and green. Isjenn crouched near one of the pools, dipping his hand into the water. It was warm, but it also seemed to pulse faintly. He withdrew his hand quickly, wiping the moisture on his tunic. The faint sound of footsteps suddenly arose over the gentle splashing of the pools. He froze and rose slowly, scanning the shadows. A figure emerged from far inside of the chamber. A man in tattered clothing. His face was gaunt and hollow. He was carrying a broken bow that he was using as a walking stick or crutch, and limped toward Isjenn with great effort. "Nothing awaits you further in."
"You're one of the settlers, aren't you?
"What happened here?" The man shook his head, his eyes filled with fear. "There are no answers. There are only shadows. Shadows and things that hunger. We tried to fight it, but it's too deep, too old." The scout's strength gave out, and he collapsed to the ground. Isjenn rushed to his side, but the man's breathing had already slowed. With a final, strained exhale, he was gone. Isjenn bowed his head briefly in respect. Another warning. Another fallen warrior. He knew something ancient and malevolent had awakened here. He rose to his feet and gazed into the depths of the cavern. Shadows and hunger. Let's see if they're ready to face me. The next chamber was a circular hall. It had towering, intricately carved stone statues arranged in a perfect ring. Each statue depicted a different figure. Some humanoid, others monstrous hybrids of beast and man. Their stone eyes seemed to watch him as he passed between them. At the chamber center lay a raised dais, upon which rested a large artifact. It resembled a fusion of a key and some sort of mechanical device. There were complex grooves and symbols etched along its length. The artifact began to glow faintly, as though it responded to his presence. Isjenn approached cautiously, feeling an inexplicable sense of connection to this object. He had to claim it. It felt as if it was his all along and he had merely forgotten it. He hesitated for a moment before reaching out, and as his fingers brushed the artifact, a shock of energy surged through his arm and into his mind. The vision swallowed him whole in an instant. He was no longer in the chamber, but in a thriving city deep beneath the earth. The streets bustled with activity as figures clad in flowing garments moved between massive geothermal structures. Towers of stone and metal glowed with harnessed energy. Streams of molten rock flowed like rivers through intricate channels. Isjenn saw their achievements. A civilization that had bent nature to its will, thriving in the shadows in the earth. But a vast, looming darkness stirred at the edge of the vision. He saw the people's fear as the darkness crept closer, saw their futile attempts to try and contain it. Rituals performed, sacrifices made, yet the force grew relentless and unstoppable. A final image seared into his mind, an eruption of chaos. Shadows engulfed the city, and the ground trembled violently. The people screamed as their world collapsed around them. In the heart of the calamity, a monstrous shape emerged, wreathed in fire and shadow, its dozens of eyes burning with malevolent purpose. Isjenn gasped and staggered back. The vision shattered, leaving him trembling and drenched in sweat. The artifact continued to glow softly in his hands. He glanced around the chamber. The statue stood unchanged, yet something was different. The air felt even more stale and heavier than before. He fumbled for his torch and checked his surroundings again. The flame sputtered weakly, its light dimmer than he remembered. A chilling realization dawned on him. Days had passed. Somehow he'd been lost in the vision's grasp for far longer than he had perceived. Time slipped, he whispered hoarsely, shaking his head. He steadied himself, clutching the artifact tighter. Whatever curse or power bound this place, it was warping reality itself. Isjenn's steps echoed through the endless corridors. The artifact he carried pulsed faintly, guiding him deeper toward what he now knew to be the core of this forgotten civilization. He felt the presence of countless others who had walked this same path before him. The settlers of Flatshade, explorers, perhaps even the ancient inhabitants themselves. Their stories lingered in the stones like faint fading memories. The tunnels opened into an impossibly vast circular chamber, where massive pillars reached skyward into the open shadows high above. If there was a ceiling to this chamber, it was beyond his sight. A platform of polished granite dominated the center, etched with more of the cryptic symbols Isjenn had seen throughout his journey. Around the platform were scattered remnants of humans, tools, broken weapons, and scraps of tattered clothing. They bore the unmistakable design of flat-shade settlers. He approached the platform cautiously, each step sending a ripple of energy through the ground. As he neared the center, a low, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating deep within his bones. From the edges of the platform, spectral figures began to materialize. Men and women, their forms translucent and wavering like smoke. Their faces were twisted in fear and sorrow, and their mouths moved silently as if trapped in an endless plea for help. Isjenn stood his ground, though his grip on his hammer tightened. He recognized some of the faces from the visions, ancient citizens and settlers alike, each one marked by the same terror of their encroaching darkness.
You're all trapped here, aren't you? Bound to this place.
A spectral woman in ornate robes stepped forward. Her expression was solemn but desperate. Though no sound passed her lips, the air around her shimmered with her unspoken message. Images filled Isjenn's mind. The island's core, a great rift in reality where the very essence of the land bled into shadow. She saw all those who had tried to seal it, and their efforts failed one by one. The darkness consumed them, twisting their bodies and souls into eternal guardians of this cursed place. Isjenn clenched his jaw.
You fought, and you lost. But you're still here. Still trying to keep others from meeting the same fate.
The woman's form flickered, and her eyes locked onto the artifact Isjenn carried. The message was clear. It was both a key and a burden. To try and wield it meant risking being claimed by the same fate as those who had come before him.
I'll finish what you couldn't.
The hum intensified as Isjenn climbed onto the platform. The artifact in his hand began to glow brighter, resonating with the chamber itself. The symbols on the floor shifted, rearranging into a spiral that pulsed with a deep red light. A low, guttural growl reverberated from the depths below. The shadows coalesced into a monstrous shape, an entity that defied form, tendrils of darkness, eyes like burning coals. Its gaping maw exhaled the stench of decay and ancient fury. It was the heart of the island's curse, the force that had swallowed the civilization and the settlers alike. Isjenn charged without hesitation. His hammer arced through the air, striking one of the creature's tendrils. The impact sent a shockwave across the platform, but the beast recoiled only briefly. It lunged at him with terrifying speed, forcing Isjenn to roll aside. The battle became a dance of light and shadow, the artifact in Isjenn's hands guiding his movements as if it had a will of its own. He struck again and again, each blow carving through the creature's formless body, yet darkness seemed endless, regenerating faster than he could destroy it. The specters around the platform began to chant silently. He could feel their strength merging with his own, their shared purpose transcending time and death itself. With a final strike, Isjenn drove the artifact into the center of the platform. The symbols flared with blinding light, and the creature let out a deafening roar as it began to unravel. The chamber shook violently, cracks spreading through the floor and walls. The entity's tendrils flailed wildly before disintegrating into nothing. The light faded slowly, leaving Isjenn standing at the center of the ruined platform. The artifact lay dormant in his feet, its glow faded to nothing. The specters watched silently as the chamber began to stabilize. As Isjenn staggered to his feet, he met the eyes of the robed woman. She nodded once before her form began to dissolve. One by one, the other spirits faded into the shadows as well. As their light faded, Isjenn stood among the crumbling remains of the platform. The artifact lay dormant at his feet, but the oppressive darkness had been lifted. He expected relief, a sense of finality, but instead, the chamber trembled once more. Across the far side of the room, the wall split apart with a deep, resonating groan. A chill ran down his spine as an unsettling presence wafted from the depths beyond. Something even older and even more dangerous than the entity he had just vanquished. The specters did not reappear. Whatever task they had remained for was complete, but Isjenn understood. This new path had been hidden from them as well. This was the heart of the island's ancient curse. And a heart had many chambers. Another faint whisper echoed through the archway. He picked up the artifact, which was now icy cold to the touch. His journey had not ended. He crossed the threshold into the unknown, knowing full well that this was a place which no one ever returned from. Justin Chu describes this game as a world building and character building exercise, and that it is pretty well adept for any type of genre you wanted to go for. At its core, Kthonic Descent is a solo journaling tabletop role-playing game. But what's interesting about it is that when you start the game, you roll on a quest table. You roll a 6-sided die, and it determines what type of quest you're going to be partaking in. Specifically for me, I rolled that I was trying to find a lost settlement. Once you start playing the game, you roll on a series of prompts. As you go through, you are exploring more about not only the environment that you're investigating, but also you're learning more about your character as you go through. One of the prompt series that does come up while you're playing the game is a series of flashbacks. And depending upon how you roll, you're rolling 3 d6s. It will determine your level of success. If you have a flashback that you roll a success on, it's something that is a positive reminder for yourself, or it is a learning experience that comes into play. But I will say that one of the aspects that did come back to bite me ultimately was as you're playing through the game, you are picking up traumas depending upon how you roll, or if you come to an area and you find a reward, whether that be a new item, a treasure, or something along those lines. The end of the game happens when you get to the final prompt and you have 9 rewards. If that's the case, then you succeed and you won the game. If you get 6 trauma playing through the game because of bad rolls, the game's over for you and your character is lost. In my case, I never got that many traumas, but I also didn't get that many rewards, which means that my character was successful in everything he tried, but didn't gain enough rewards to win the game, so to speak. So narratively, the way that played out through this writing exercise that is Kthonic Descent was that my character was in this underground labyrinth and was never seen again. One of the things that was really occurring to me while I was playing the game, however, was I'm one of those people that's played through Elder Scrolls Skyrim, half a dozen times, I think. As soon as I rolled that it was a lost settlement, the overarching theme of this game is a descent into something. That Skyrim history kicked in for me, and the first thing I thought of was one of the Dwemer ruins in Skyrim, which is called Blackreach. And if you have ever played Skyrim and got stuck down in Blackreach for hours on end trying to figure out how to get out of there, that was the first thing that came to my mind. So as I was going through and building this world as a creative exercise, in my mind, it was like an abandoned settlement that no one knew what happened to the original denizens of it, but they had some amazing technological prowess and had utilized this underground world, but they had also awoken something terrible and dark inside. Thank you again for listening to Your Story Will Be Different. You can reach out to me on social media via Blue Sky, Instagram, and I'm still on X for some reason. For our next session, we're going to be playing Outliers, which is an interesting solo journaling game where you are a research assistant at a location where some very unusual and borderline eldritch horrors happen. As always, I'm going to put a link in the show notes to Kthonic Descent by Justin Shu. Feel free to reach out and let me know how your descent into a dark realm goes. But just remember, your story will be different.